So I would like to cover three of our six Group 2A community flight procedure packages in some detail. And the one that I want to start on first is the GLS Down the Bay 1 or GLS DB1, just because I think that's a good starting point for us to talk about what's in the packet, what we're hoping members and residents can glean information wise and how to look at it all kind of in that way. And then I'm going to go to the Overwater 1 and Overwater 2, OW1 and OW2. So I've already gone ahead and downloaded each of the PDFs, and I'm going to do my best. So I respect many of you in the room may have a printout of this. They are, I know it's not super environmentally conscious, but they are meant to be printed. In some cases, the pages these packages are put together in such a way that they're meant to go left, right, so to speak. So when we're looking at it as a PDF, I don't have quite the same capability. So the first page of the community flight procedure package is basically like it's like an index that tells you which pages of the PDF contain which information. And all of our community flight procedure packages have exactly the same details, the same calculations, the same graphical formats. So the way that we do this is the first page is the page numbers are down here in the lower left corner. So our first page here that's kind of our landing page or index, it's 0. So when we say page 1, 2, 3, 5, 7, 9, et cetera, it is referencing not the PDF page number, but the printed one that you see on the lower left corner here. So just an important first detail. And what we see here on page number 1, printed page number 1, is our three-dimensional depiction of the proposed approach procedure. And what we typically do is we use a couple different colors to show the phase of the approach, as it's being designed. The red one in this particular approach procedure, that's the final approach. Ironically, that is the segment that the ground-based augmentation system is where it is actually performing, where it is delivering the precision and the autopilot guidance and the flight director guidance, all the way in the future to touchdown on the runway. So this very short segment for this particular procedure in red, that is the part that the ground-based augmentation system is actually delivering. Every other part of the approach procedure is not using the ground-based augmentation system. In this case, it's using the RNAV RNP navigation specification. So the white segments here are what we call the intermediate approach, and that's basically how we connect from the beginning of the approach to the final approach segment. And then the blue is the initial approach. So we're before the blue is where we're in the high altitude structure. We're on an arrival. In this case, we're on the bodega arrival, and aircraft are making their way towards this waypoint called D-Bay. And then once an aircraft is cleared to the D-Bay waypoint, they are now on the approach, which means they are on the path you see right here on printed page number 1 of the PDF. And this is, again, kind of from a scale perspective, the altitudes that they are going to fly and the track that they're going to take to get to the runway for the DB1. So we've got some white boxes. These are the names of the waypoints that are currently being used as we evaluate the procedure. You're going to see these names of waypoints appear kind of throughout the package in other places. So when we look at the calculated noise, like the green and the purple, you're going to see these waypoint names again. When we look at the profiles, where we're trying to show what the speed of the aircraft is, what the calculated flap settings were, you're going to see those waypoint names again. And they're all intended to help people reading the packet get a sense of, okay, where was I? I'm halfway between waypoint 152 and guts. Oh, the aircraft is in a turn. It's just trying to help you kind of navigate between the pages that way. The other thing that's important on this first page is on the 2 boxes on the bottom left and the right. On the bottom left, that is our team's kind of English description of what we think this procedure is trying to do and why we are pursuing it. So, we have kind of just a short explanation, talking about the procedure as if it was its own thing. And then the second part here is how what we're comparing it to. So in this case, the text says, it's the GLS DB1 is the instrument approach to runway 28 right, originating northwest of the airport, starting at the D-Bay waypoint. And then we give some more text to say this approach is similar to the GLS Whiskey runway 28 right from D-Bay. for those of you that don't have the secret decoder ring in front of you, GLS Whiskey is a Group 1 innovative approach procedure that is the down the bay approach. That's the first one that I think everybody was able to review. We're calling it GLS Whiskey because that is the FAA's official designator for that approach now that it's under development by the FAA for publication in March. So it's very similar to it until it gets to waypoint 152. It then turns the aircraft, trying to keep it over the bay as best as possible to connect to the GLS Romeo and the RMP Yankee track. And then there's other information to say if this is requested for development, this procedure would be used under most weather conditions for aircraft arriving from the north and northwest on the Bodega Star. And then on the right hand box, it talks about which project goals we're hoping to achieve with this concept. So noise reduction, number 1, ILS redundancy, because at the end of this approach, we will still get ILS category 1 minimums or something very close to it. It does have an efficiency aspect to it. So if you are an aircraft coming from the north, this is one of the shortest paths that you can take to get to land on 28 right. So there is an efficiency aspect there. It also has the opportunity to reduce delays because again, it's a relatively short track. And because this is an instrument approach procedure and not vectors, this gives pilots the opportunity and air traffic controllers the opportunity to clear the aircraft and then go on with managing other flights. So working on other aircraft separation and trying to find ways to potentially get out of a delay situation. So that was page 1. Page 2 of the publication. This is where we're providing some kind of technical detail about the procedure that's being proposed, but it's a very important page for all of our green and purple sections that you're seeing. The left-hand side shows the existing approach that we are using to compare our proposed concept to figure out how we're calculating the noise differences. So what that means is the approach on the left is the one that we're assuming kind of is the starting point. And the approach on the right is the other one. We calculate the noise for both of them. And then that's how we come up with our green and our purple. So in this case, because we know the GLS Whiskey is going to be published on in March of 2024, and we know that it's a representation of a vectors maneuver that's done with some frequency today, we're treating that approach as our baseline. And then the concept that we're evaluating is on the right-hand side. Now, I apologize if you have a printout, or if I can zoom in quite a bit, actually, you can actually see quite a bit of detail. For those of you that are pilots, this is what we refer to as a flight inspection graphic, and it actually contains quite a bit of detail. Now, you'll see a note on here that says not for navigational use. We are required to place that on these charts because this is not loaded into an airplane yet. It has not been quality assured by the FAA yet, so do not attempt to fly this. But what you're seeing here are more precise definitions for the waypoints that are being used. And if you're really into interpreting charts, you'll see some very important clues that show up on these charts. There's 2 of them right here at the beginning of the approach. So if you look at the right-hand graphic under the word DBAS, you'll see this number that says 11,000. And then right beneath it, you'll see this next numerical character sequence that says 210K. The 11,000 and the fact that it's got a line above and below it means that aircraft, when they get to DBAS, have to be at 11,000 feet. They can't be higher, they can't be lower. Now, I don't expect everybody to know this, but I'm just kind of telling you because you're going to see this a couple of different times on some of our approach procedures. Those lines tell the pilot when they get to that waypoint at that altitude, whether they have the freedom to be higher or the freedom to be lower. So a good example, today at Eddy, as an example, it's at 6,000. There's no flexibility. The aircraft has to be there, so there's bars above and below. When we look at our Overwater 1 and Overwater 2 examples, you will see that there is no top bar, which means that the aircraft in some cases may be permitted to be a little bit higher if air traffic is able to get the aircraft there. So just an interesting thing to note. 210K is a speed restriction. And in this sense, might be hard to make out, but there's a bar above it. And what this means is that for an aircraft to start this approach procedure, they must have already slowed down to 210 knots, which it's a nautical mile per hour. And that's an indicated airspeed. So, again, thinking about Eddy and the over energy situation, Eddy, an aircraft must be at 240 knots. On this approach procedure, they have to be at or slower than 210 knots before they begin this approach. So already this page is already telling us that this aircraft is not going to be going super fast. It's going to start off at a very high altitude. Again, we can use these pages to go back and forth. So I'm on page 2. I'm just going to go back to page 1 very quickly. So when I look at this picture here, which is the 3-dimensional depiction, and I see this very tall blue bar over kind of the more of downtown San Francisco, and then I go to page 2 and I zoom in a little bit, and there's other pages where you'll see this, but I'm just kind of using this one as a reference. You'll see that that aircraft's going to be at 11,000 feet when they cross over downtown San Francisco. Some of the other things you can read from this are minimum altitudes. I'm not going to go into as much detail on that, but those are the minimum altitudes that the aircraft has to be at as they get to each successive waypoint, which means that by the time they get to GBAS 2, this number right here, where it says 7,000, and then 095 and 109T, the 7,000 is the minimum altitude. They can't go below that as they're heading for GBAS 2. Those minimum altitudes published on the segment are another opportunity for this approach to keep the airplane a little bit higher, keep it closer to that optimized profile descent, and potentially reduce noise as the aircraft comes through. So the speeds are important, the altitudes are important. These pages are very important to making sure we meet the goals. There's one other restriction that you'll see here, which is we have another one of those we have another numbers in a letter, 180K, and a line above it. What this means is that the aircraft had to be at 210 knots or slower when they started this proposed approach. By the time that they get to this waypoint 152, they actually have to be going slower than 180 knots. And that's in order to make this turn. If they're going any faster than that, there's a risk that the aircraft may have to bank so hard to make the turn that it decouples from the approach procedure. So from a procedure design perspective, we put that speed limit there to basically tell the pilots by the time you get here, you need to be slow, and then you're going to have exactly the right amount of margin to safely make the turn. So go ahead, question, yes.
Question, yes. So you're talking about certain elevation and not to go below a certain threshold. Would there be instances, and this is how you're designing your approaches, right? Yes. Would there be any instances where the pilot will not follow that? Or what happens if the pilot does not go below or above and so forth? What safety measures, if you will, from our perspective for noise, are there for this approach to be adhered to? Great question as always. So there are two things that will make sure that a pilot and the aircraft stay on this approach procedure. So because these legs are designed with the RNAV RNP specification, the Boeing and the Airbus aircraft, which are the two primary types that are going to fly it, they have this coded into their flight management system. And the pilots, when they activate this approach, because they're cleared to fly it, the aircraft and the flight management computer is going to keep the aircraft automatically above all these altitudes. So the only situation that the pilot could go below any of these altitudes is if a human being took the controls and said, you know what, I want to go sightseeing. I'm gonna go lower than this. So that would have been a human in the cockpit decision, or God forbid, some kind of wild automation problem, or maybe an aircraft problem. There are other opportunities though, if for some reason the TRACON needed to create some separation. Let's say that they need to put some space between an aircraft that's on this approach and one coming into Oakland or something like that. It is possible sometimes for the TRACON to choose to take an aircraft off of an approach and put it back on, but they have to do that before the intermediate fix, before the start of the intermediate approach segment. So if they were going to do that, they would have to do that in this initial approach segment. But by the time they get to in the proposed procedure guts, which is the one I'm circling around right here on the right-hand side, on the left-hand side, the waypoint is actually at CPIN. The aircraft, they have to get everything back on altitude by CPIN. From that point on, if the aircraft is below altitude, that's a missed approach. The pilots are trained that if they've gone below those altitudes, they have to discontinue the approach. The only time they can go below prior to that intermediate fix is if the air traffic control told them to do it. Otherwise, air traffic is watching them, and they'll see that the aircraft went below, and they may tell them, hey, you're too low, pull up, like you're not on the approach anymore. Does that answer your question by chance? Absolutely, thank you. Okay.
And another question, if I may.
Sure.
these waypoints for these GLS procedures, they are fly over or fly by?
Super good question.
Waypoints.
Yes. The current procedure that you see here are designed. So if you see like a little star-shaped symbol, and it's just the star, it doesn't have a circle around it, those are fly-by waypoints. The one exception is at the missed approach point here. See how, so if you're looking at the printout, there's a point on the chart called VICU, and it's a star and it has a circle around it. That's a fly over. So all of the stars that don't have a circle around them, those are flyby waypoints. So the aircraft, and maybe this is where you were going with this question. So for instance, when they go from D-Bay to waypoint 152, somewhere around the GBAS 2 waypoint, the aircraft flight management computer is going to anticipate that a small turn is necessary, and it will literally fly by it. It won't go over GBAS 2. It'll just avoid it and get onto the next track. This leg here where they go from waypoint 152 to guts. So even though those don't have a circle over them, the way the aircraft is going to navigate that is it's going to fly it almost exactly like that radius. So it doesn't have to go over the waypoint to start or finish it, but the way the navigation computer is gonna treat that leg is because it's called an RF leg, it's gonna keep it right on that arc. We're very close to it. Does that answer your question?
It answers the question, but it brings up other ones. Why wouldn't they have a circle if that's the case?
So if there are some criteria problems with having fly over fixes at the start or the end of an RF leg. So there are very, very specific situations where the FAA is permitted to design a procedure, where, the beginning of the RF leg has a flyover or the end of it or both. Generally speaking, you try to avoid that situation just to give the aircraft a little bit of flexibility to get into the turn and get out of it smoothly. That may not be the best answer to your question, but in this particular case, we would expect if the aircraft needs to make this turn, if anything, it will fly just inside of it. So it would not go to the outside of the leg, it would go to the inside of it ever so slightly, and then catch up to the rest of the RF and then come out again just on the inside of it. So the risk for this procedure is that the aircraft might be more over the water rather than less over the water.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Other questions before I move on? So on the bottom of this approach, or of the bottom of page 2 of the CFPP, we've got information on the bottom left that talks about our team's understanding of what percentage of aircraft are capable of using the approach. It doesn't mean that they're going to use it. That is going to be more up to the weather and air traffic and how things are going on the day of operation. This is our projection of how many aircraft are coming into San Francisco at the time that this concept would come into existence that could, if they were given this approach, fly it. The reason, so you'll notice regional business jets for us is very, very low. Right now, there are very limited plans for regional jet aircraft or business jet aircraft to become GLS capable. We hope that changes in the future, but for now and for the next couple of years, we don't see that number coming up. That's why it's a very low number. For the narrow bodies and the wide bodies, that reflects our current understanding of the aircraft types that are coming in from the north in this particular situation. So just to be very blunt, right now, American Airlines and Alaska Airlines do not have the op spec to fly a GLS approach. And obviously those two operators fly a fair amount from northern destinations, as does Delta. But we do know that United and Delta, some of Delta's fleet types and a larger majority of United's fleet types constitute the 30% numbers that we see there. And then we know that Southwest is actually just in the process of activating its op spec for GLS. So these numbers may go up a bit, but that's what we're estimating there on the left. So it may go higher than 30%, but we're starting with that estimate for now. The right-hand side is our team's estimation of when this procedure would be used relative to weather conditions. So you'll see here we have 4 levels: VFR, MVFR. So VFR is visual flight rules. It means like there's not a cloud in the sky, there's no rain, everything's beautiful. MVFR is mostly VFR, which means there's a little bit of a cloud kind of here and there. IFR is when we are now down and certain category 1 minimums are starting to come into effect. So IFR is like the clouds are relatively low, or we have more limited visibility. across the bay, and then low IFR is yeah, we're into like ILS category 2, category 3, category, where there is like the clouds are down on almost on the runways themselves, and we're not seeing very far. So GBAS can actually work in all 4 conditions. But these procedures that we're talking about are not all intended to be used under all conditions. And what you'll notice here is that this particular proposal to use the down the bay 1 is intended to be used even up to IFR conditions, like standard kind of category 1. But when we get to really low IFR, this is not this particular procedure is not one that is intended to be used by air traffic. And the reason for that, and I'm going to go back to this picture, is one of the stakeholders that are interested in this particular concept from the flight procedures subcommittee are very interested in this because they believe that there may be more opportunities to use this procedure because it has this curved leg right here with other aircraft that are already coming into 28 left. And so there is a hope that if this procedure is of interest to the community, and it were to go forward and be published, that this one would be used while other aircraft are coming into 28 left. That generally requires good weather to be happening. So if we're getting into kind of cruddy weather, those separation rules change, and you couldn't use this one at the same time as one of those other approach procedures, or you can only use it, more sparingly. So we're only expecting this, through IFR. I'll pause there before we go to the next page. Questions? Hearing none. Let's go to the first of, oh, go ahead.
Nobody on Zoom? Okay, go ahead. Well, thank you.
Sure. So now we get into the first of the calculated noise pages. And there's a couple things that I'm going to want to point out both on this page and the next one. So as we've talked about in the past, we have 4 different aircraft types that we are presenting here. So this one is narrow body 1. And again, we have restrictions. We're trying to use the most accurate performance model that we can and the most accurate noise model that we have available to us to come up with these noise calculations. And the problem is we have a restriction that says that when we use that platform and that technology to put noise out there that directly compares 2 aircraft side by side, which is kind of what we're doing, we're not allowed to say what the aircraft was, because that's just a condition. It's a license agreement that we have to sign with Eurocontrol to get this kind of higher powered data. So we have narrow body 1, which is a representation of kind of the current generation of narrow body aircraft that are capable of flying GLS approaches. We have narrow body 2, which is kind of the more modern and emerging narrow body aircraft that have like the newest engines with all the newest kind of noise reduction capabilities and the highest thrust capabilities. So those are also GLS capable as well. So just to throw some example airplanes, narrow body 1 would be like your standard 737s, your standard A320s, things like 757s, etc. Right? That's like a narrow body 1 kind of aircraft. A narrow body 2 aircraft, I'm just going to jump to it so you can look at the page. This is like a 737, like a MAX 8, like the MAX aircrafts, or the NEOs, the A320 NEO family. Those are the kinds of aircraft that would fall into narrow body 2. Wide body 1, in this particular case, is really representative of like a 2-engine wide body aircraft. So things like your 777s or your A350s or A330s or things like that, frequent visitors to SFO. And wide body 2 is more like your 4-engined visitors. So A380s, 747 family in that nature. Not as many aircraft in this particular family, but enough that we can use these 4 terms and stay within our requirements not to make direct comparisons. So again, we've got 4 different sets of data here. And what we've got is the black line that you see on just looking at page 3, that is the flight track. So to Member O'Connell's point about flyby versus flyover waypoints, I'm going to zoom in a little bit. One of the first things you'll notice is that when the aircraft, we've started the aircraft back here at Bodega, just to show where the plane would come from, as it comes from the arrival onto the approach. And because the start of the approach is not fly over, you'll notice that black line, which is where we think the track of the aircraft is going to go, does not fly over D-Bay. It goes just to the north of it, right? It curves just past it. Again, when it gets to GBAS 2, it curves just inside of it. When it gets to the RF leg, it's going to be pretty close to on track. So it cuts around. I'm sorry, was there a question or a comment? I'll keep going. And then for this particular procedure, even though it's a bunch of fly-by waypoints, because they're RF legs, we are expecting, and the software that we use to do this also expects the aircraft is going to stay on that black line fairly closely. All of our noise calculations for the proposed procedure are based on the black line that you see. The existing procedure that we're comparing to, we don't show that track here, but that's what we're using to make the comparison calculations against. So I'm going to back out in the zoom just to this level right here. So what we're showing here are the noise contour that you see with the dashed line. That is the noise contour that was calculated for the, trying to make sure I've got this right. For in this case, this is for the proposed concept. So the green represents how those contours are shifting from the existing approach, which in this case was the down the bay, to the new proposed concept. So if it's green, it means it's shifted, it's shrunk, or it's moved away from a populated area. And if it's purple, it means it's expanded. It's moved somewhere that it didn't used to exist before. So if it's expanding, that means that there's a potential that there's increased noise in these purple areas. And if it's green, it means there's a potential for decreased noise. One of the key things to keep in mind when you're looking at this way of looking at aircraft noise is that we are making a division for these little polygons every 5 dB SEL. So it's a single event. It's not combined. And it's 5 decibels, which should be 5 decibels should be perceptible to the human ear. Usually 3 decibels is like the cutoff. So 5, you would most likely hear that change. If you start to see one contour overlap with another one, like in a green area, like I'm showing right here, that means that if you happen to live in this area where there's overlapping green contours, it's possible, based on this calculation, that for a narrow body aircraft that's flying this approach, the noise reduction for you would be more than 5 decibels. Like that's a pretty good outcome. Like the best procedures when you look at noise this way would be ones where the noise contours actually start to overlap with benefit. That is most likely going to be noticeable, but it's important, and I've got to really stress this when you're looking at the CFPPs to remember what we're comparing. So in this case, we are comparing the GLS whiskey, which is the down the bay approach, to the DB1. That's the proposed concept. That's what you're seeing here with these changes. So we're not trying to, like the down the bay one, the down the bay approach did have some advantages. It had some slightly higher altitudes. So the fact that this approach still finds ways to improve and potentially reduce noise in the residential areas means that this could be a very beneficial procedure from a noise perspective, which is one of our goals. So that's one thing that I want to point out. The bottom half of these graphics is a simplified way of looking at the people who live in the calculated SEL contours. Again, these are not CNEL contours. That's a different concept, a different kind of math. This is one aircraft making the flight, which we think is the most comparable way for how residents experience, that flight or that one airplane. So in this case, we take these contour intervals. So the 50 contour is this one here. It's this huge contour that goes all the way out to Bodega and wraps all the way around. We look at the people that live inside of this huge, 50 dBA contour, and we say, if that contour shrunk, how many fewer people are now in that contour? If the contour grew, how many people are in that contour now? And in this particular case, we found that the populations that were exposed to 50, 55, et cetera, it all decreased, basically, because the noise was further constrained over the Bay Area itself. On the other point right here where you see sample points, this is where this little box right here, this is where we are trying to provide some other comparison information about what's happening at specific points. In some cases, we're using a noise monitor, like an established noise monitor. In other cases, we're using like a waypoint. So in this case, we were looking at D-Bay, which is here, and Axmul, which is right about here where this arrow is pointing to. So an interesting side effect of this particular approach, this just shows the altitude differences here. I'm going to zoom in because it's probably hard to see. This shows the altitude differences here. So at D-Bay, the existing procedure and the one that's being proposed, exactly the same altitude, and the noise, it's calculated the same way. By the time the aircraft gets to Axmole, however, even though this aircraft is taking a slightly tighter procedure, we actually expect that the one that we're proposing would be about 100 feet lower. If you were to look kind of down the bridge, basically, and go between this point here, which we call Dawn 9, we're just trying to give it a name, versus Axmole, the aircraft would be 100 feet lower. But in spite of the aircraft being lower, because it's further over the water, if we were just looking at this spot right here, the calculated noise is significantly lower. So it's just a different way of kind of looking at the noise in the sense. Before I move on to the next graph, the next page that supports this, questions? Let me stop.
None here.
Okay.
There are no member questions on Zoom either.
Oh, I'm sorry. Was there a question?
No, no question.
Perfect. The next page tells us a lot about why that noise calculation looks the way it does. So what we provide here are 4 different profile graphs. All of these are taken from our calculation. And in this case, the orange path and all the orange profile views that you see, that was the existing calculation. And the blue lines that you see, that's the one that's being proposed. So you can kind of see the comparison. It gets a little bit complicated in these group 2A procedures, because in some cases, the procedure that we're trying to use as the baseline and the proposed one have very different track miles, and they have very different altitudes. And so things start to get very different when you look at it this way. But from the spirit of transparency, why we want to share this information so that people have all the information that we have to help make determinations. So the top one is the altitudes. And as you can see here, the altitudes between the proposed and the existing are almost completely identical. There are some very small track mile changes, but it's fairly straightforward. The flap setting information here, you can see how we think the schedule of the flap settings would basically transpire. And then we show net thrust. Net thrust is very important because that's the value that's being used for the noise calculations. And so if you see one procedure as you're moving kind of, so on the right-hand side, we're at the beginning of the approach. On the left-hand side, we're at the end of the approach, kind of getting to the runways. So if you see the net thrust starting to be higher, for one profile or another, that's a likely source of why the noise might be increasing. The last one we see here is for the ground speed. So each of these charts that you see here corresponds to the noise calculation that was made here. They go hand in hand. So we have that data for the 4 different aircraft types. Again, just looking at DB1. So this is narrow body 2 and its supporting information. You can see that there's some potential calculated thrust differences that are happening for this aircraft. And that translates to, more significant potential noise reduction. When we look at wide body 1, again, we're seeing, primarily, the potential for noise reduction. There are some very, very thin purple bands that you see here on East Bay. These bands are related to the fact that this waypoint right here had to shift a little bit further to the east than the waypoint we're using for the upcoming down the bay approach. So even though the aircraft are going to be very high and they're going to have slowed down and they're going to have better kind of energy management opportunities, these purple bands are just a relationship to the fact that this waypoint had to go to the east a little bit. I know Christian Valdez couldn't be with us today, but one of the things he wanted to point out is that when you see very, very small bands, be they purple or green, they're very likely not going to be perceptible to the human ear. So if, the distance between this line and this line is 5, if 3 is where you start to hear it, you can imagine you'd basically have to be, over halfway of a contour to be able to really hear that in that area. So that's wide body 1. Question?
So one question on that. In this flight track, would it give you an indication of where speed brakes might need to be applied?
That's a great question. Here's where my team looks to see if we think speed brakes might be applied. So we actually look at these charts with considerable detail. And what we're looking for are situations where either the speeds, this bottom chart down here, are starting to get a little bit mismatched, where the existing speed or the proposed speed are starting to get a little bit high. We're also looking at this box right here, which is the net thrust. That net thrust box is telling us what did the performance model think had to happen for that aircraft to continue to slow down to make the approach. One of the warning signs is, and this almost got there, but it didn't. If you ever see a graph like this, where these orange values or these blue lines go below the axis, that is an indication that the aircraft, the performance model could not slow itself down just by cutting off the thrust, which means that the only tool left to slow that aircraft down was a speed brake or some kind of aerodynamic deceleration. So the program just magically makes it happen. It says, well, I don't have any more net thrust left, so I'm going to make like a negative net thrust. Not actually going to happen in the real world. What negative net thrust actually means is speed brakes were deployed. So we look very closely at these net thrust tables here to see if we're running into that situation. And then that gives us the indication that a speed brake would need to be applied. In this case, we're very close, but for this particular aircraft, we don't believe it would happen. They're actually just starting to, this is where they're starting to come around to the final, almost the final approach. So they're going to be getting into the landing configuration, which you can see right here. They're already at a very high flap setting. So we wouldn't expect speed brakes. We just expect landing flaps to be deployed. Does that answer your question?
Okay, because landing flaps can also be quite loud, and so I'm not sure how that would, so when we see these vertical lines with the straight drop down on this chart in the thrust box, is that showing flaps or is that showing, would that be speed brakes? What's causing that other than just letting off the gas?
It's a great question. Yeah.
What's causing that to happen?
Great question. Yeah. So in this particular area right here, the orange is the existing. This is the one that is currently under development. In this area, the wide body one aircraft, in some cases, may find that they need to deploy a landing flap a little bit earlier than what we are calculating. That is the risk. So when they get close to, and we can look at this like the guts or the seep and waypoint, when they're out here, I'm still on wide body one. When they're out here, there's a possibility that as the procedure is currently designed, the existing procedure, not the one that we're currently evaluating, there's a possibility that they might need a slightly higher flap setting at that point, basically to continue approach. That's what this chart is telling us right here.
Okay, because, I'm only using my personal limited flight knowledge of when I'm on a plane and we're getting ready to land, and you can tell when they're doing things, when they're letting off the gas, when they're giving it gas, when they're putting flaps, and when they're doing speed brakes. And I don't know how that is, received on the ground because I'm in the flight, but that's the only time
Well, I usually say, pardon me for interrupting, but I usually say if you can hear it on board, odds are you're gonna hear it on the ground as well.
True, but most of the time I'm just hoping they're gonna land and not worried about the rest of it. But anyway, I just wanted to ask that question.
I have one quick question. In looking at the, any of these, the narrow body two, when we're looking at, that shows a little bit of purple in it. This is comparing it to the down the bay. What's the down the bay GLS called? The one that's going to be in
Its official FAA designator is the GLS whiskey.
GLS whiskey, okay. So if we were to look at if we could magically combine the GLS whiskey with this one and compare it to the existing flight tracks. Now, I know there's no current published procedure for the down the bay. There was briefly right after next gen, but that disappeared fairly quickly. But we do have, a lot of historical vectoring down the bay, right?
Yes.
And so that's what people are used to getting overhead then, is this historical vectoring. So is there a way that we can compare that historical vectoring with a combined GLS whiskey combined with this down the bay? So they'll get it in piecemeal. They get a little bit of change in whenever that is, January, March, whatever, and then they'll get another bit of change later on. But if we could look in advance and combine those two and say, overall, what are we getting for our people? Can we do that?
Very possibly. I know Bert's got a lot of the historical vector tracks that we could try to combine. Are you asking if we could use the vector tracks as the basis for a noise comparison? Is that what you're thinking?
Yes, if you want to give it a new name, a community basis an actual
Historical basis.
a perceived basis by the community today, before any of this is implemented, because we know we're looking at two things that are coming down the pipe for this. And we don't really know what we're getting at the end of that two process.
Yeah.
This compares it to part one, and then part one compared it to, well, never compared it to historical, I don't think.
That's correct. Part one, there was no, we didn't attempt to make a single event comparison to vectors. The vector tracks are all over the place from what we've seen as a team. Lots of really creative work, high skill air traffic and pilot maneuvering to get the aircraft to come around. But yes, some of those vectors take the aircraft over more populated areas on the East Bay. Some of them are very, very tight coming in, and I think the short answer is, is there something we can potentially look at? Yes, I need to take it back with Bert offline and just figure out what the best way to do that is. But maybe we'll have something by our next TWG to present on that particular front.
Because my thinking now is, if you look at this and you see those purple lines, albeit they're very thin and narrow ones and probably not discernible to the people, that probably is not an increase to the actual perception on the ground today that they're getting. This is compared to an intermediate step that still doesn't exist today.
You're correct. You're correct. We are comparing. Yeah, you're right. These noise increases would be very, very difficult to perceive on this side relative to a procedure that, you're correct, has not yet come into existence. Yeah.
So it's just hard for me to see how I could say, oh, green is good, purple is bad, when purple might not be bad at all, because we don't know what the vectoring is taking.
We don't really know what they're flying now
Today.
because they don't always fly the procedure. They
There
get
is
it
no
vectored
procedure.
Really,
Yeah.
it's vectored all the time.
So we sort of need like an actual impact baseline for what is going on overhead their houses right this moment. Does that make sense?
It does, and I see Joe put his hand up, so I might let Joe take a jump in.
Yeah, the difficult part here is I guess we really have to look at the tracks, because you could be potentially comparing apples to oranges. Because you're going to have a procedure, an aircraft on a procedure, right? They're going to fly that procedure minus the margin of error, whatever that is for this procedure, right? Where when you're talking vectoring aircraft, that's much different, right? They could potentially be lower altitudes, they could be way off. So you could essentially be comparing apples to oranges. I'm not saying that's the case here, but depending on how those tracks are, you may be comparing apples to oranges here. If you were to exhaust that means of trying to do that. I get what you guys are saying. And I'm trying to think in my mind how to best do that as well. But I think it may be very difficult for Paul and his team to do something like that, just based on the sole fact that those aircraft are being vectored and who knows where they're going to be. And then how far out do you go? Do you include in that noise contour that you're going to compare to what today is, right? So there's all different factors in there that are going to be very difficult to manage there. Sorry, Paul, I didn't want to.
Nope.
So we don't know, looking at this chart, if we're doing the people in the East Bay any favors, or maybe we are doing them favors by giving them a controlled approach that is going to be lower than what they're getting now from vectors. We don't have anybody know that.
Well, what we can do is take the flight tracks that go down the bay and drop into what we use for modeling make a spline out of it, figure out where the heaviest percentages are and the allocations left and right of center. And just do that.
Yeah. I think we need to.
I think it'd be a guesstimate, but you know, all of this
Very educated.
Yeah. it's
is
close
a
enough.
guesstimate.
Yep, I think we can take that action away and see what our team can come up with. And so I'll take that one for our team.
Thank you.
Yep.
You're
So
welcome.
just I'm trying to be respectful of the time, and I really appreciate that. I'm probably going into a lot of detail. There's one last thing that I do want to cover relative to the CFPP, and then I'm going to jump over to the Overwater 1 and Overwater 2 to go through those, not in quite as much detail, but just to chat about the Overwater 1 and Overwater 2. So I'm on the PDF, the printed page number 11, again, looking at the bottom 11 and 12. They're very, very similar looking, but all of our community flight procedure packages have these. And this is like our summary section. And this was created, so we've got all this information in the preceding, 10 pages. And then we wanted to draw everybody's attention to these kind of more simplified views to look at least some, what we think are key data points to help, compare again, that baseline procedure to the one that's being proposed. So the existing procedure here, which is the GLS whiskey. So we've got information about, I'm going to zoom in a lot. So this is narrow body 1 and narrow body 2 are on page 11, and then wide body 1, wide body 2 are on page 12. And it's meant to be just kind of a left-right comparison. So population within the 60 dBl SEL contour, again, single event sound exposure level. So we can see the population. So for the proposed with the GLS whiskey, it's 76,000. With the DB1, it goes down to 57,000, and then we show that difference here. So that's a decrease of 19,000 people in the 60 dB SEL. Do the same thing for 75. We have our altitude comparisons for kind of two key locations. These locations change by each CFPP. We try to pick points that we believe are important to the folks who are doing the review. We have our SEL calculations. And then, so we can see how those potentially change. And then we have the speeds, because some of our procedures, we are looking, at a procedure that might have an energy related problem. So we want to give that. And then we have a breakdown of our number of arrivals. Now, this is we hope that we could break down the number of arrivals to this kind of granularity between, 7 a.m. local and 7 p.m. local, and then, starting to get into sunset and then getting into the nighttime hours. At this time, many of our procedures, it's far too difficult to predict, this kind of dispersion. There are some where we think we might be getting some better estimates, and we can revise this in the near future, especially for Overwater 1 and Overwater 2. But for right now, we have these kind of broken out in this way. And then we have, does the innovative approach meet current regulations? For the DB1, and we've talked about this a little bit, we do have this challenge right now with TCAS modeling. And again, that's because there is a hope that this proposed procedure can be used at the same time that other aircraft are landing 28 left. But for that to work means that there's a TCAS challenge that has to be resolved that has not been fully resolved just yet. So even if we get through this year and the subcommittee and the roundtable believe that this is a good procedure to take forward, we may still have to resolve this TCAS issue. So I know it's a very small point in a very long packet, but it's an important one that we need to point out.
What is TCAS?
Traffic Collision Avoidance System. And it's a super valid question. And TCAS it's an important system on aircraft that helps 2 or more airplanes that may be flying in close proximity to each other to anticipate where each aircraft thinks the other one is going to be. And if they think that they're going to get too close to each other or potentially collide with each other, that computer, that system tells the pilot of both aircraft what to do to try to resolve that situation. In some cases, it saved lives. It has actually worked the way you hope, and it overcomes otherwise human errors. In other situations, like San Francisco, the box gets a little bit aggressive. And even though two sets of flight crews and air traffic know exactly where those planes are going, even though they look just like they're heading towards each other, the box starts to go off, the TCAS starts to go off, and it tells the pilots to do something that would not result in a landing, that would result in a go-around. And that's one of these challenges when we have runways that are very close together, is that system gets very aggressive. And we have to be very careful and try to design our procedures to minimize the likelihood that those TCAS warnings go off when it's where we want the planes to be. It's a big challenge. It's a now challenge. It took out one of the suggested procedures already because it was just going to be a TCAS one. This one is not quite as bad, but we need to evaluate it in more detail before this procedure could be published. Other questions? Okay, hearing none, I want to spend just a second to talk about the overwater one. So I'm not going to go into the same level of detail with the package that we did, but we have two overwater procedures, and I recognize we only have a few minutes left. Chair Hindi, is it possible to go just a few minutes over today?
Absolutely. I think we need to, if you're willing, we would appreciate it.
I'm more than willing. I'm here to answer as many questions as I can. So thank you for the extra few minutes. For the overwater 1 and overwater 2, again, we have this three-dimensional view. Now, for this procedure, you'll notice that in addition to the blue and the white and the red, we have these green boxes. And the green boxes here are intended to help our readers of the community flight procedure package to understand that there is a definite benefit or something positive that's potentially happening just in the way the procedure is designed. Set aside noise calculations, set aside ground tracks. And so in this case, what we're saying is that we're comparing this proposed overwater 1 procedure. We have a higher altitude at Eddy than what we were comparing it to. So today, there's a mandatory altitude at Eddy at 6,000 feet. For these overwater procedures that we're examining as potential procedures in the future, that altitude goes up by 1,000 feet, and the required speed comes down by 30 knots. So not only are we getting the planes a bit higher, we're also reducing the speed at the start of the approach right there from the asset for this particular example. So there are some potential benefits that could come along with that. There are also restrictions that come along with this particular procedure because it could not likely be used during high traffic periods. So this would be like a late nighttime thing. And I know we've talked about that before, but I want to point that out. So with some great benefits comes some restrictions. Those altitude gains actually remain. So if you're heading down towards side-by, we're 300 feet higher than the procedure we're comparing to. And that 300-foot gain lasts all the way out until the aircraft gets out over the water for this particular example. So that's what the green boxes are attempting to show. Again, just to point out, our project goals here, noise reduction, yes. ILS redundancy, yes. Efficiency, no. This is not a more efficient path into the airport. We would also not anticipate that this approach does anything to reduce delays. This is a noise abatement procedure through and through. So again, another key here for us, and I'm looking at today's community flight procedure package. We chose as a project team, the GLS uniform as the baseline for comparison. And the reason why I wanted to lead off today's TWG talking about the fate of the GLS uniform being delayed to December of 24 is that we think we need to update this community flight procedure package to choose a different approach procedure to compare it to, because it's going to be a long time before anybody has a chance to hear or experience that GLS uniform. And one of the things we would like to do is to take our overwater 1 and our overwater 2 proposals and compare them to the existing ILS. This was a recommendation from the TWG participants, and I think it's one that we'd like to take seriously. So I'm just going to show this page from the PDF. This is what you have in your hands right now. For each of our 4 aircraft, we are showing purple and green relative to an upcoming procedure, the GLS uniform, which already had some noise benefits. We've gone ahead and we've calculated the same graphics, and I put them in this handout for all of the airplanes. And that's what I'd like to do right now, because we're planning to change our CFPPs this month for the over 1 and overwater 2 to reflect this noise calculation here. So just going through it very quickly, if we compare the proposed overwater 1 to the existing ILS or existing GLS overlay, they're identical. This is the kind of green and purple that we would see. So I'm going to go to a big screen here. This is narrow body 1. This is narrow body 2. I apologize that the map jumped around a little bit. I'm so sorry. When they get in the CFPP, it's a bit cleaner. So now in narrow body 1, you can see that there's virtually no purple. These purple areas, by the way, this is something we struggle mightily with the noise calculation platform that we have to use. And the challenge comes when we are calculating one path that has a specific set of track miles versus a different path that has a wildly different set of track miles. And we have to try to get them so that they match back up and the calculation starts at the same point in the beginning. So these purple lines that you see here, in particular for the overwater 1 and overwater 2, if you see them here, that has more to do with a calculation kind of accuracy rather than a real world noise increase. So I want to point that out, that we are not expecting any noise increases here. That's just a challenge we run into with the platform we have. So we do see huge amounts of potential calculated noise increase, for narrow body 1 over, roundtable cities, and definitely coming backwards into Palo Alto. And then as we look at the narrow body 2 aircraft, again, very similar. There's a very tiny increase in purple here. This is not a calculation error. This is intentional. And that has to do with the fact that this waypoint right here, overwater 204, is slightly west of the existing ILS track. And that's what's happening here. That's what these tiny little purple bands are. They would be very difficult to perceive, but that's what's happening. So we want to point that out. When we go to wide body 1, again, similar, we do see that little shade of purple right in here where my cursor is moving, but overwhelming green areas for most of overwater 1. And then wide body 2, again, we do see more of the purple in this case. And again, this purple is related to the fact that this waypoint right here, overwater 204, is just slightly west of the existing track. If we look at overwater 2, which is the more aggressive kind of overwater path, and we compare it to the ILS, again, this is what we're seeing here on the screen. And these are going to go into the CFPPs unless there's a strong reason why we shouldn't do this. Very open to comment, obviously. Again, we see even more significant potential noise decreases with the overwater 2 design. But something I want to point out is that you do see that this purple area here to the east starts to pick up just a little bit. And I apologize, it's a bit hard to see, but you do see that the noise increase starts to occur here in some of the areas that are kind of just before the shoreline. So while the path of the aircraft is not necessarily changing from an area where airplanes fly today, the noise that could come along with it for some of the folks who live in this area could be slightly louder. So I want to point that out, that is a possibility with the overwater 2. Even though it's higher altitudes, even though it's better energy management, there is a possibility that, when we look at not so much for narrow body 1, but for narrow body 2, there's a slight possibility. For wide body 1, it's a very small possibility, but wide body 2, again, there's that possibility again.
So excuse me, what you're showing us on the screen right now is not in our packet. What we have is, what is this actually comparing it to?
Right here.
Yes, it's a great question. And so if I go to overwater 1, what's in your packet right this second, you have graphics that look like this with significant purple areas on one side versus the other. This one compares the proposed overwater 1 procedure to the GLS uniform or the RNP Yankee that's out there today. Because that GLS, go ahead.
But the first ones you were comparing it to the ILS procedure, which we don't have those graphics.
That's correct. The project team would like to change the CFPPs this month to reflect this as the baseline for comparison, if you all believe that is.
And the baseline we're currently using is what baseline?
The one that's published right now is the GLS uniform procedure, which has not published and will not publish until December of 24 now.
So do I understand, Paul, that you're suggesting that what you have up on the screen now will replace what we're looking at in our packets now by changing the comparison to an ILS rather than the GLS?
Correct.
Yes,
Yeah.
this change. So the delay, the decision to delay the GLS uniform to December happened Friday. Otherwise, we would have come to you with a slightly different set of expectations on what to present, but we're trying to adapt to the change. And so we believe that because that GLS uniform is so far off now from publication, it's probably better for us as a team to use the ILS as the basis for comparison.
Well, and it also, this would not meet the goals of the community based on the GLS because it doesn't reduce noise reduction. And so it would be something that would get bleeped.
Well, that's a good point as well. And this is a challenge of looking at a single flight to compare noise. Is that it becomes very sensitive to which procedures we're comparing against. So go ahead. I feel like
Well, you'd want to compare it to something that's gonna make it look favorable. And it certainly doesn't look favorable using the GLS procedure. And it does, in theory, look favorable using the ILS. But is that what our people are really gonna hear?
For clarification, the ILS is what everybody's getting overhead right now, correct?
that's correct. That's correct.
But that might be replaced with the GLS.
Right, but this is the one he's showing us now is comparing it to reality. So
Right,
that's-
and
Yeah,
this.
This
what-
one, yeah, this one here on this.
Maybe being implemented.
Yeah, this one here on the screen, yeah, it is the closest comparison to what a resident living in South Bay cities right now would experience, right? It just, like if you're out there tonight and you hear an aircraft come in
Like the
and
vector versus not on the map before.
Yeah,
Okay.
so this is a good, great valid comparison for community purposes.
Yes, okay.
Yeah,
yeah, so
Thank you.
but I respect, and I just as one member of a team respects that this may be a situation, and I'll take a look at the overwater too, that maybe looking at it two different ways is the best way to get to the highest value feedback. Because comparing it to the ILS would potentially lead someone like myself to think that both the overwater 1 and overwater 2, they both look like they could achieve our project goals when we compare it to the ILS. So if we then, wanted to dive deeper and compare it to what you have in the packages, then we get a slightly more refined look at how would it stack up against, procedures where we've already tried to make some other enhancements. And in this case, just looking at the information that we've provided, I'm just going to look at the overwater 2 as an example. The overwater 2 example looks a little better at achieving its goal than the overwater 1 does. At least that's kind of that's what I'm seeing with all the information that I've got calculated.
And the overwater 2, you're not going to be changing whether it's from, and this is still based, overwater 2 is based on which?
So
comparison?
great question. The packages that you have printed out in front of you, they're both based off of the GLS uniform. They're both based off of that procedure that's now not going to get published until December of 24. We are proposing to change our CFPPs, to basically reflect the ILS for both of them, so that you can compare overwater 1 and overwater 2 exactly the same way. That's what we did in this package in our PowerPoint here for today. So here's overwater 1 as narrow body 1 against the ILS, same thing, overwater 2. And you can see that I'll click back and forth. So this is the overwater 2 procedure. This is the overwater 1 procedure. So you can just see, like, there's a little bit more green, over the places where people are living. There's a little bit more purple over the water. They both look like good concepts when you compare them to the ILS. And then when we look at how they stack up against, the GLS uniform as an example, that's where we see that potentially the overwater 2 looks like a more compelling procedure than 1. So, it's our suggestion to change the CFPP. Another possibility is that we have 2 CFPPs. We have one that makes the comparison against the ILS, and we have a second that makes the comparison against the GLS uniform.
Well, the GLS, we're not experiencing yet.
Correct.
And so we really have to wait until that is experiential to get really what's going to be on the ground.
That's a true statement. Yeah.
Okay.
So we believe it might be more beneficial and simpler to use this as the basis for comparison. We're prepared to make that change to our CFPPs this month.
Very good.
So that was the primary information that I wanted to get through today. Again, just one more chance to take a look at this. And we've shown this graphic before, but I think it's a useful one. Overwater 1 is the path that kind of cuts here on the more left-hand side of the screen. Overwater 2 is the more right-hand one, and the line running right up the middle is the existing It is closer to the existing ILS approach, basically. So I just, yes.
Okay, Paul, for clarification, did I understand that the reason that the Overwater 1 is somewhat to the left of the Overwater 2 path due to the fact that you needed some space to get them turned once they get out in the middle of the day?
Yep.
So that's the reason for, yeah.
Yeah, and it was one part that, and it was also because we were trying to find two different ways to get the aircraft out over the water. So Overwater 2 is like the most aggressive path that you can take to get out over the water, but it results in the aircraft flying over the Meta headquarters essentially. And the other path is to try to stay within, well-tread paths. So the Overwater 2 path takes you essentially a little bit away from the RMP Yankee, a little bit into a new track. But the Overwater 1 stays within existing tracks. It basically, the Overwater 204 is like you were flying the tiptoe, if that makes
So
any sense.
could you make, not today, but some point, overlay this with the ILS so that we could see how they line up with the current ILS?
Yes, I apologize for not having that today.
Right.
And flying over the Meta headquarters is a problem. Why?
Well, I'm just pointing it out as a landmark. I'm not here to comment on.
I'm not sure where that landmark is, so I just wondered what the reference was to that.
My apologies. I just know where it is because it's such a big facility.
Where is it on your map?
Let me pull up actually, let's go to the website and I'll zoom
It's on
in.
this side of the Dunbar Bridge, right where the Dunbar Bridge empties at University.
Wouldn't want to piss them off, right?
Why not?
No, it's just, it's.
So I've gone to our GBAS landing page here on the noise.flysfo.com website, and I'm pulling up the GIS portal. And I'm going to pause. I'm going to zoom in as best I can. It's just rendering a little bit here. I'm going to do this kind of 2 levels, so I apologize. But basically, the Meta headquarters is like right in this area here, where my cursor is kind of moving around.
Okay.
You can see the bridge.
Yeah, I see where the bridge
Right
is.
there.
I just wasn't sure what the significance was.
There is a.
I don't know. They pack a little power.
Okay.
So that's all the materials I had to share for today. So again, our proposal is to update those comparisons here for the Group 2A CFPPs this month, if that's acceptable to members of the roundtable, TWG in particular. The other thing that we are planning on doing is to try to keep up with the FAA proposed changes to the GLS uniform. As I mentioned, there's some waypoint changes. They're very minor. We think they're going to be beneficial because they're further away from human beings. We have those waypoints, so we'll get those incorporated in a CFPP update just to honor our commitment to keep you all informed. And there are some very minor tweaks to GLS 10 right, 10 left that they won't change the noise calculation, or they shouldn't change the noise calculation, but we're just trying to be accurate. So we'll get those out there too. And it is still our goal to seek feedback and approval from the roundtable by December of this year, if possible. But as I mentioned at the beginning, we are still getting suggested procedures. So if we keep getting suggested procedures, or if we find we need modifications and that yields us needing more time, then we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. So we'll do our best to take those suggested procedures and turn around those that the Flight Procedures Subcommittee feels have a chance at being published. Chair Hindi, that's what I had for today.